I've been thinking a lot lately about a huge swath of books that I seem to have been reading during this pandemic. And I've been wondering at the same time what it is that really makes for a good story. I think good stories have to do with facing hardships and perseverance, about overcoming challenges and developing resilience. It's like the story of the little engine that could, who happens to be a female train engine, in case you didn't know that. Resilience is something that we all need in our lives. And as we read some stories, if those stories are all about mountaintop experiences, those seem unattainable to us. And in a sense, with all honesty, they may even seem flat. And a story that has all experiences that take place in a valley may leave us feeling uninspired, or even worse, hopeless. You see, we don't need resilience if we're never faced with any challenges. Resilience is what helps to keep us on an even keel when the waves of life crash against us. Resilience is like the gluten that develops in bread, because it only develops its elasticity as that bread is kneaded and put under pressure over time. So as I think about my COVID reading, I'd like to share some of the stories that I've read about. And some of these books, many of them were actually written by friends of mine. One called Crossing Over is an autobiography by my very first boss. He was born in India, raised in a small village without running water and with dirt floors. He skipped school a lot as a kid. He was mentored in high school by a man who was blind and had memorized the entire math book, so he could point to a specific page in his mind and a specific problem as he mentored my boss. He was eventually admitted into a coveted place in the India Institute of Technology and accepted into a master's program at the University of Washington. He arrived in the United States with literally $8 to his name. And then he went on to become one of the top executives of one of the largest global companies. Another book I read is called The Orchid and the Dandelion. It's a seminal work by a friend and pediatrician whose entire life work has been research on why some kids, who he calls dandelions, seem to be hardy and resilient and can thrive no matter what circumstances they're in, while other kids, who he calls orchids, are sensitive and fragile and susceptible to becoming troubled. Yet what his research has shown is that orchids, if they're surrounded by a supportive, nurturing environment, can thrive even more than dandelions can. We have one of each of these flowers in our family. Another book is called Being a Girl, Growing Up Ambitious and Female. It was written by a former colleague of mine who is a PhD scientist and was working in a male-dominated field. So she tells her stories of the lessons she learned along the way and shares ways to become resilient with other professional women. Now, you may be thinking that you need to get to the later seasons of your life to be able to look back and have enough wisdom and to share that with others. But just to show you that resilience is not age-related. Another book I've read is called Enabled. It's a book of poetry by two young women who are sisters. One has Down syndrome. And as I've watched these two young women grow up, I can tell you that the love they have for each other is what has enabled them to face all their individual difficulties in life. Now, over the past 4 weeks, we have been looking at stories of people in the Bible who have something to teach us about resilience. And Graham has spoken about Joseph and Moses and Ruth and Paul. Today, I'd like to look at Peter. Peter is impetuous. He is impulsive, and he is totally lovable. Of all the 12 disciples, Peter is the most dominant character in all of the 4 Gospels, and not always in a good light. He's fallible, he's human, and he's just like each of us. Now, what I'd like to do is take a look at all the stories of Peter from the Gospels. And so I've attempted to cobble them all together in a timeline of his life. And I hope you'll give me some poetic license to do so. And here's how the story starts with Peter. Peter and his brother Andrew are the first to be called by Jesus to be disciples. Jesus' invitation to them has to have been extremely compelling, because they were out fishing and they dropped their nets immediately and followed after Jesus. Peter witnesses firsthand the healing power of Jesus. He sees Jesus heal Peter's mother-in-law. And when Jesus heals the leader of the synagogue's daughter, Jesus takes Peter and James and John along with him, and Peter knows he is part of Jesus' inner circle. We next learn that the disciples go out in a boat, and a storm comes up, and they see Jesus walking on the water, but they don't know that it's him. They think Jesus is a ghost. And when Peter recognizes that it's Jesus, he gets out of the boat and he begins to walk on the water. But when he notices the waves and the wind, he begins to sink and he yells out to Jesus. And Jesus reaches down and lifts Peter up. They get into the boat and the wind ceases. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up to the top of a mountain where they witness Jesus talking with Moses and Elijah. And Peter, wanting to do something practical, offers to pitch a tent for each of them, somehow missing the really big picture of what's going on here. But no matter what, this is a true mountaintop experience in the timeline of Peter's life. Peter is usually the one to ask Jesus to explain his parables and the one to clarify boundaries. When Jesus says that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, Peter gets a little whiny. And he says, "Look, we have left everything to follow you. What then will we have?" And Jesus says to him and assures him that they will receive their due in due time. Then we read that one day in the market, a woman reaches out and touches the fringe on Jesus' garment. And Jesus turns around and he wants to know who has touched him. And Peter gets a little snarky and he says to Jesus, "How will we ever be able to tell? This crowd is pressing in and it is too big." He pushes back. And then as we approach Jerusalem towards the end of Jesus' life, Jesus sends Peter and John to prepare a Passover meal. And during dinner, Jesus starts to talk about the one who would betray him. Peter, who is always the instigator, motions, and he might have tilted his head or pushed the disciple whom Jesus loves to ask Jesus who he's talking about. And Jesus tells the disciples that they will all become deserters the night of his arrest. And he says specifically to Peter, "I have prayed for you that your own faith may not fail. And you, once you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." Now Peter says to Jesus, "Lord, I will never betray you. I am ready to go to prison and to death with you. And though all will become deserters, I will never desert you." And Jesus says to him that he will deny Jesus 3 times before the cock crows. Later that night, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John to Gethsemane, and he asks them to stay awake and support him while he prays. 3 times Jesus goes away to pray, and he tries to teach them by example, by grounding them in the importance of prayer. 3 times he goes away, and every time when he comes back, they are all asleep. And when a crowd that night comes to arrest Jesus, Peter draws a sword and he strikes the slave of the high priest and cuts off his ear. And he's chastised by Jesus. As they drag Jesus off, Peter follows from a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And he warms himself by the fire, just hanging in the shadows to see how things are going to turn out. 3 times some bystanders say to Peter, "We saw you there with Jesus, I mean." And 3 times Peter says, "I don't even know the man." And then, as we know, the cock crows 3 times, and Peter weeps bitterly. Now, one of the things I love about the gospel stories is that they tell us what people say and they tell us what people do, but they rarely give us insights into what individuals are thinking and what they're feeling. In a way, I think what this does is it invites us to read ourselves into the text and to have the text read us. So when we see Peter weeping, it's one of those rare insights, and we might presume that what Peter is feeling is shame. Shame because Jesus knew that Peter was not strong enough to declare that he was a disciple. And then we know that on Easter morning, Mary and the other women report to the disciples that the tomb is empty. And Peter, always the impulsive one, runs to the tomb and he races with John. And Peter gets to the tomb, inside the tomb first, and he sees that it's empty, but leaves with empty explanations. And later, Jesus appears to the disciples. But here the Gospels are silent on whether there was any conversation between Jesus and Peter. They had unfinished business between them, Peter and Jesus did. We're left wondering if there was ever any reconciliation for Peter's denials. So what does Peter do after this? He goes fishing. He goes and does the one thing that he knows how to do when nothing else makes sense. And the disciples go with him, but they don't catch a thing. And then they see Jesus on the shore, and Peter, again, being the first to act, jumps in the water and swims to shore, and the other disciples bring the boat in. And here Jesus and Peter have a beautiful dialogue in which Jesus asks Peter 3 times, "Peter, do you love me?" Why does he ask 3 times? Peter may have felt a stab in his heart each time, knowing that he promised to follow Jesus to the death, but he denied Jesus instead. And yet Peter says, "Yes, yes. Yes, I love you. 3 questions and 3 opportunities to erase his denials. And then as we begin the book of Acts, on the day of Pentecost, Peter becomes the first and most prominent spokesperson for Jesus and the early church. Now, you may have noticed that I skipped over one section in this story and left a blank in Peter's timeline. And I want to return that now because I wanted you to have the entire context of Peter's life before we get here. So turning to our text for today from Matthew 16. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." Jesus said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter, again, always the first one to answer. He's like the Hermione Granger for Harry Potter fans. He's always the first. And Simon Peter answers, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter. And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Now, Jesus' declaration to Peter seems to come out of nowhere. On this church, on this up and down life, I will build, on this rock, I will build my church. So what is this rock? Peter's name in Greek means rock. It means a stone or a boulder. But the word Jesus uses here for rock is slightly different. Instead of Petros, he uses Petros, which means a mass of rock or a cliff or a firm foundation. Now, theologians don't all agree on what rock Jesus is referencing here. Is the rock Peter? Is the rock Peter's confession of who Jesus is and therefore extends to all of us? Or is the rock Jesus himself, the firm foundation? Perhaps the rock is all 3 of these things, because all 3 are necessary to build the church. Now, no matter how we interpret this, we have to agree that this strong affirmation of Peter has to have been a mountaintop experience for him. And this is, quite frankly, where most messages would end. But I want to take us just a few verses further. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the 3rd day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "God forbid it. Lord, this must never happen to you." But he, Jesus, turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are not setting your mind on divine things, but on human things." Ouch. That has to have pushed Peter back more than just a few paces. There's only 6 verses between Peter's confession of who Jesus is and his rebuke of Jesus. 6 short verses between his assurance of Jesus' identity and his fear of what was going to happen to Jesus and all the rest of them. 6 short verses between hearing Jesus say that God has revealed this truth to Peter and then accusing Peter of setting his mind on human things. 6 short verses between the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. 6 verses between a solid rock and a really rocky place. Now, as we look over the entire timeline of Peter's life, we can see that it was filled with highs and lows. And we can also see that there are through lines, or there are guardrails around Peter that protect him through his life. And those same guardrails are with us. The first of those is the assurance of God's supporting presence in times of need. And the second is the promise that evil will not prevail. Throughout Jesus' entire time with Peter, he was trying by practical lessons to help Peter build up his resilience by teaching him spiritual disciplines about fellowship and community, about prayer, and about being with each other and listening to Jesus' teaching. By asking hard questions to build up Peter's resilience. By allowing him to voice his fears and his doubts. By Peter's being willing to be forgiven and forgiving himself. And by letting Jesus' love wash warmly over him and erase that shame as they shared that intimate meal on the beach that last morning together. And in the end, by making everything right. Recently, I was listening to a podcast of a conversation between Mark Labberton, who's the president of Fuller Seminary, and Pete Docter, who's the creative director for the latest Pixar film called Soul. And in this conversation, Pete Docter tells that their inspiration for the main character in Soul was based on a true life story. And they decided based on this story to make their main character, a man named Joe, into a jazz musician. And here's the story. It's a story told by Herbie Hancock, who was a great jazz pianist. He's playing a piece called So What with Miles Davis, the great jazz trumpeter, and it was a mountaintop experience. The music was tight, it was powerful, it was innovative, it was fun. And then things got very rocky. As Herbie Hancock tells the story, he says, right in the middle of Miles' amazing solo, I played the wrong chord. It sounded completely wrong, like a big mistake. He continues that Miles paused for a second, and then he played some notes that made my chord right, which astounded me. He was able to make something that was wrong into something that was right. Now, as we close our time together, I'd invite you each to take a look over the timeline of your life, about the total sum of all the stories in your life. And I invite you now to close your eyes as I take you into a reflection. Where have been your mountaintop experiences? Perhaps right now you are standing on solid ground with the full assurance of God's presence. If so, use this time to express your gratitude. Where have been your rocky places? The times when you have wondered where God is. Like Peter, we doubt. We whine, we get snarky. We miss the big picture. We are impulsive and we deny our faith and we fear the future. Maybe you are in one of those rocky places right now. If so, ask God to be present with you in this time of need. God, you have the entirety of our lives in your hands. And if we stand on solid rock today, use this time to strengthen us. If we are in a rocky place, reach out your hand to lift us as you lifted Peter, and be our strength. Give us your peace and assurance that in the end, all will be right. Amen.